Hey, what's going on, everyone? Welcome back to another episode of Adventures in DevOps. Joining me once again in the studio today, Warren Parad, CTO of Authorize. What's going on, Warren?
Hey, thanks for having me back, Will. And last time I promised a fact, so I know you were waiting the whole week to hear what it was going to be.
I've been on the edge of my seat.
Well, this is a good one, actually. Google actually just released a report, not that long, really short, about 0 days, and I think it's so relevant given what's happened with the XZ compression library recently. And what's interesting in there that I found most interesting, actually, was that in 2023, there were 10 exploited 0 days in IT hardware vendors. So you can think of these as like Cisco boxes that are running in your corporate environment. So, if you ever thought about, should I have one of these or not? Do they add security? Now you may have an answer.
Right. That's cool, especially on the heels of that exploit, because I could talk about that for quite a while. But
I know, right?
But we've got Jose here waiting to jump in. But just for the patience and diligence of that attacker, I mean, that's just a slow clap from me. Bravo for playing the long game. But meanwhile, joining us also in the studio, Jose Diaz-Gonzalez, creator of Dokku, which this is going to be cool. I can't wait to hear this story. I just assumed that the name came from a Star Wars reference, but Jose is going to set the record straight. Jose, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me. I'll just get into the story, actually. So I think I'm not the original maintainer of Dokku. There's a guy named Jeff Lindsay out there who maintains quite a bit open source, and he started this, I think, in 2013. And so I think the original pronunciation he used was Dokku. I never heard this pronunciation until years later. So I, for background, Dokku is somewhat of a Heroku clone. So Heroku being a platform as a service. And so in my head, I was like, Heroku, okay, Dokku, because there's a D in front, which is great. So I've been mispronouncing it for about 10 years. The other part of this is that the Star Wars reference here is actually pretty good. I track references to the project on social media and various platforms. And about half the time, there are references to Dokku on Twitter, for instance. There are references to Star Wars because people mispronounce Count Dooku's name. There's 1 K and 2 O's. There's also a Korean pop star whose dog is named Dokku. He's got 3 dogs, is my understanding. And then in Japanese, Dokku is the word for doc, I believe.
Wow, if you can cash in on the K-pop reference, that could be huge. Because that's legit internet traffic right there.
I don't know what the overlap is between K-pop stands and folks who need servers, but
there is a thing of preferential attachment. So even seeing it or hearing it, even if there's no relation, if small overlap, you'll get those customers and brand value eventually. So maybe you're doing something right.
You got to play the long game. Just look at the attacker for the XZ exploit. The long game pays off.
It's good.
Yeah, actually, when I saw the platform, I was thinking Docker. So Dokku was where I was going initially because I think the logo is like the whale or something, right?
Yeah, So the whale logo is actually also another interesting story. I don't actually remember where the whale reference came. I know that Heroku's a long time ago, a lot of their media was Japanese samurai references, that sort of thing. Just a lot of Japanese pop culture references. Sushi kind of made sense to me, and I was all right, cool. Let's put a little whale sushi on its head. Had a friend of mine, I bought him lunch and he designed me a whale logo, and then he said he would never design a whale logo for me ever again. So that's why we only have one picture. I unfortunately am not an artist or an illustrator.
If you wait long enough, you may be able to use the image as a source image with one of the LLMs and get image creation going to pop out some, the exact same whale logo, but in different poses and backgrounds.
Long game. I like this.
Right. That's hilarious. So let's talk a little bit about, well, now I'm like, how do I say it? Do I say Dokku or do I stick with my name, Dokku?
Pick the one that you prefer, and then I'll run with it.
This is the official branding. Like whatever you say right now, Will, that is what it's going to be from now on and going forward.
Dude, you don't want to trust me with big decisions like that. Look, I've got quite a few decades.
Say your pronunciation on it.
Yeah, I've got quite a few decades of experience here that show that I am not the guy you want to count on. No, we'll go with Dokku because I think after hearing Jose's explanation, we've got Docker as a replacement for Heroku, and if you smash those two together, you get Dokku. So that's what I'm going to try to say until I get into the middle of a sentence and my brain goes, you know what? Say it this way, dude. And then I do and butcher it.
You broke it, really. You know, I noticed that I should never guess on pronunciations because if I do, that whatever one I guess wrong first is now stuck in my brain forever. Right. So if I get in one of those situations where I'm like, it could be either way, just like stop, take a moment, look it up, and then commit because, you know, otherwise you're broken for life.
Yeah. So Dokku is an open source PaaS alternative to Heroku. And if you're not familiar with Heroku, it's a hosting platform that makes it just incredibly simple to launch and build your app. I've used Heroku multiple times in the past, and that used to be like my go-to thing for all the early stage startups that I worked with. I was like, just launch on Heroku. It will get you so far down the road without your infrastructure becoming like a thing in your company that it's a no-brainer solution. And then I think in the last year or so, I thought Heroku was going out of business, but I just checked and it looks like they're still up. But something happened where Heroku got like shamed, and I can't remember what that was. Warren, I see you grinning.
Yeah, Salesforce bought it, right? I think that was the shame.
Was that the trigger?
I don't know. I don't want to swear.
2014, 2013 that they got.
So that was a while ago.
Something like that. My understanding there is that a lot of the product development shifted at Heroku. A lot of things went into maintenance mode, and a lot of things went into like very forward-looking as opposed to like immediate delivery. And so they stagnated as a platform for quite a while. And I think like a lot of other platform as a service platforms have come out since then and have differentiated themselves in one way or another. They're starting to re-release new features and functionality, but it's kind of like a long game that they're playing, I think.
Gotcha.
Yeah,
gotcha.
Sense.
And it feels like I have no data to back this up. So this is a certifiable fact, but it feels like there's a big shift in people's preferences to not use AWS and GCP anymore. Like people are looking for alternatives to that. And so I think having Dokku here might be a segue into that. So Jose, can you tell us a little bit? First of all, I want to know how you ended up being like the primary maintainer of this. Were you just like the last one to leave the room and just like, damn it? Or is this something that you're actively pursuing?
No, my university, I went to Pace University here in New York. I ran like a software media consulting firm within the university. It was kind of like paper 10 consulting. And when I left, another student took over that role. Part of that was also like me giving them the actual server that we ran all these like projects on. I didn't want to pay for this thing anymore. I didn't want to pay for any of the like software. I wasn't really involved. It didn't really make sense from a lot of perspectives. Right. But I knew for a fact that those folks were like very focused on like a particular language or a particular framework, not super familiar with like the server stuff. And if anyone remembers like infrastructure work from like 10, 15 years ago, that was actually like pretty significant amount of work. Like you're spending as much time setting up a server as you are working on your actual like product. And so I looked around for projects that maybe could like fill in the gap. We didn't have them like as a sort of like student run consulting firm, we didn't have the money to like spend on actual Heroku or any of these other platforms or services. And like they had actual needs for some of these features and functionality. And so I looked around at projects that were available that I had like previously looked at, potentially like contributed to. Dokku was one of them that I had previously contributed like a very small patch. And I was like, oh, I wonder how that project is going. It was effectively unmaintained for about a year, but it was like close enough that I was like, okay, I can give this to students and they can kind of like bottle fit. It's not very complex like software. Their needs aren't very complex. So let me go see if I can like kind of revive it. And it took a little bit, but I was able to convince Jeff Lindsay, who's the original maintainer, to grant me commit rights, and slowly and steadily took over the project from there.
I see where this is going.
Right.
The students never actually ended up installing the software. They just shut down a bunch of those projects and were like, oh, we don't need to run these anymore. But I kind of just ended up maintaining this project, mostly solo for the past decade.
Dang, that's commitment. That's commitment. So what are the big goals that someone is trying to achieve that would lead them to picking Dokku as their PaaS service?
Yeah, so we have like a pretty eclectic mix of folks. There's a huge number of folks that like just ran away from like hosted platforms or managed services such as Heroku.
Mm-hmm.
Heroku, I think in 2016 or maybe 2017, they changed their pricing to remove their free tier, or at least significantly cut back on the free tier. And I think that makes sense for a lot of these PaaSes. It's a money sink, and potentially not something that like increases their finances. So we have folks who are just like, I can't afford to spend $7, and that includes folks from like developing countries where they literally cannot afford to spend, or they actually like physically cannot pay for the service. We have users who are like in countries that like just cannot use like financial like systems that we're comfortable with. We have folks who have like dozens and sometimes even hundreds of like toy applications that like also cannot spend $700 or $800 on like, here's my like first baby toy app, but still want it running, and so those folks use it. On the other side, I've known of companies that use Dokku as part of their offering, right? So they have a managed PaaS and they use that as something of a base, whether they're like side projects for that person or actually like physically like large startups that like have this as part of their offering in some sense. I've also known of universities that install it for their students because they need something that like maybe a professor's running a course or something similar. And then there's folks who are just like, hey, I want to run something locally for like my home office. I need to run that. So it's kind of like all over the place. It's not just like folks who are tinkering, it's actual companies, it's folks who are running businesses, that sort of thing.
I mean, I think you hit on a really important aspect there. If we're going to take the sort of thread that we've had in the last few weeks, if you look at these providers, you learn that the users that come on that want the free version into these platforms, they don't graduate or scale up ever, right? They're almost like a completely different set. So like I totally get the idea originally, like, oh yeah, more users is better. But what we found out in at least the last 5, maybe even decade at this point, that they don't convert to higher paying. They don't, these engineers that are using it in their free time don't convince their company to move over to say the Herokus of the world. So maybe they have a core need to go that way, but it's also weird because I feel like a lot of those platforms have anchored themselves to solving the very early engineering stages sort of thing and not at scale. So it's sort of like you're going after customers who will never pay you.
Yeah, I think it's weird because like, yeah, you need that initial base of folks, and I think there's a certain like let's say I have a Heroku account, I pay for a service there that I manage on behalf of someone. I probably wouldn't use Heroku for my personal stuff. I manage Dokku and I'm comfortable running that. But certainly like that's one of the things that like I'll say, hey, like I've used this in the past, maybe we should use this at work. And I do that with a ton of software. So I think there's part of it, like their growth strategy is not just necessarily like, here's that $7 toy app that like someone should pay us $7 for, but like that developer is comfortable with the experience they have, they're going to bring it to their work and then like potentially adopt that software there.
You mentioned something interesting there about not wanting to run this at home. So, or Heroku at home specifically. So, you have like a home lab and you're utilizing this instead of, say, having to run an expensive thing like Kubernetes or, God forbid, Docker Swarm or like a Nomad.
So actually, one of the, I think, defining traits of Dokku is that it's so extensible. It's built on like a plugin system, and it's effectively like a pipeline. You run a command, and that command, I mean, the first command that you might do is a git push, and that actually triggers, using a ton of bash logic, the actual build process, right? It just happens to be like you start a container. Dokku actually supports Kubernetes and Nomad as schedulers. So you can build your application, push it to a registry, and then like schedule it against Kubernetes or a Kubernetes cluster or a Nomad cluster. And we have folks doing that in production. I run it on a couple of different, one for like testing purposes, but I run like my local software on a Dokku server, just because it makes sense. Like I'm running like Home Assistant, for instance. I don't want to necessarily like figure out like, okay, this is the command I needed. This is, it's like I have a repository, push to the server, and I'm good to go.
Right on. And I think that's one of the things that strikes me as interesting about this is the number of things that you do support via the plugins, because that's the initial hurdle, right? You're building your application. You're like, okay, well, I need Nginx, and I need Postgres as well. And okay, now I need Elasticsearch, or Redis or whatever. And so getting a way to quickly install and launch these makes it an easier process so that you spend more time building your application and less time configuring services that you need, but like you're not really emotionally attached to them, right? Like I need a cache, but I don't really care where it comes from as long as it's there when I need it. So what's the startup experience look like for someone to get started with Dokku? I mean, you mentioned that it's just a plugin based system, and your typical first response is just a git push. Is it from a config file there? What's the level of overhead to get it up and running?
So you install the software. There's a shell script that you can download and like curl bash it if you want. We provide app repositories. That's kind of the simplest way to install. You can create an app. All of the commands I try really, really hard to mirror the command line experience on Heroku. For better or worse, a lot of engineers, at least 10 years ago, were super comfortable with that.
Sure.
And it's while there are some things I don't like about the design, it's actually like pretty straightforward to understand. All the commands are pretty trivial to like kind of remember and have in a pattern. And so if you've ever used Heroku, like the commands are literally the same, right? You app create your app, you can add a domain, you can config set an environment variable, and you push your application. I think the hardest two parts of getting an app deployed are one, getting a server that you can install Dokku on. You gotta install it somewhere. And then the second part is ensuring your initial build runs correctly. I think if you've ever set up something with CI/CD, that first set of I'm adding CI is going to take 10 or 15 commits. And regardless of what we do, I think that's pretty similar with any platform service. That first setup is actually pretty hard in some cases. The software's gotten a lot better over time. There's a lot of auto detection we can run. There's a lot of builder plugins that I have. So if you're comfortable with Heroku, you can continue using that, and many applications just run out of the box. If you want to use a Docker file, we'll support that, etc. But once you do that, you're up and running, right? You have your application, you've added a domain, it's hopefully networked from the outside in via DNS, and you can actually kind of continue on with your life.
Right on. And so then, like Heroku, you can run multiple independent applications on a single Dokku instance. Is that right?
Yeah, that's correct. You can constrain the resource utilization if you want. So let's say you have an application that's supposed to only run under 400 megabytes. You can give it just that 400 megabytes and let everything else consume the entire server. Many of our users don't do that, especially the ones who are just like, I need like a single server. It's got 2 gigs of RAM. They don't really care to constrain that. And in their case, in their head, they might not like really understand what it means to constrain or like why you would want to.
Mm-hmm.
We have folks who are like, as they scale though, they were like, okay, fine, let me start like being a little bit more sensitive to resource utilization and therefore cost, so that they know, okay, like I need to scale horizontally. I need 10 of these. So this one takes a gig of RAM. This is what I'll need. Likewise, if you're using one of our scheduler plugins, that's almost certainly one of the first things you're going to do is add resource constraints. But otherwise, yeah, you can run as many applications as you want on the server.
Right on. And as it's built, I think I heard you say this, it's built so that you can have a single Dokku instance that spans horizontally across multiple physical servers.
Yeah, that's correct.
That's
so
cool.
the Kubernetes plugin, which was recently released, allows you to basically, if you have a blank server running somewhere else, you can cluster add, give it as long as the Dokku server can SSH onto the other server, give it the IP, and then it will install all the software, connect it, and like your deployment will go to that server as appropriate.
Wow, right on.
Yeah.
I really like seeing the extension of more technology in this area because personally, and I'm sure I'm going to get a lot of hate mail now, I'm not a fan of Kubernetes specifically. And I mean, okay, yeah, you know what? I also didn't like Docker Swarm. So, you know, I've had a problem in these spaces. And, you know, I always sort of was like, I'm not a fan of what HashiCorp is doing. That's a personal preference. So, you know, I feel like I'm out, right? Like that was like the full set there. Like what else is there that, you know, supports virtualization at this level? And so like, I'm always sort of curious because like, you know, someone's like, oh yeah, you know, I'm running on, it's like, we're going to use Kubernetes. I'm like, you don't need to. It's like, oh yeah, but we're on-prem. I'm like, well, then I have no recommendation for you. So, you know, it's really awesome to hear that there are projects like at this level of the stack that are, you know, up and coming that are, you know, both have the on-prem answer. And I think I saw that you also have a cloud solution as well. Is that right?
I don't have a cloud solution. I think,
but it's coming.
I don't know about that. I feel as though like running a cloud solution is like an entire company's endeavor. I mean, like Heroku and Vercel and Aptable and all these companies exist.
Yeah.
And so I've shied away from that. Dokku has a pro offering, which essentially provides like a UI, provides an API, provides like HTTPS and like team management and things that like you might need if you're a slightly larger organization. So if you're like a consulting firm that like you have multiple folks, or maybe you're an actual startup and you're concerned about like who has access to what, that might be for you. But by and large, a lot of folks get away with like, I'm just going to install this on my server and like deal with it that way. Would a Dokku Cloud ever come? Again, I'm very hesitant to say yes. I know that there are companies out there who use Dokku as part of their underlying cloud offering. It seems like a lot of work. I wish them the best. Maybe that's not for me today. I've got my plate full with just running the open source project.
So along those lines, we talked about running this on your own physical servers and not really making this like an AWS or GCP or Azure plugin offering. But there are other providers like DigitalOcean jumps out first in my head for companies that just say, hey, here's a server. Do whatever you want. We don't care. Just pay the bill. And it seems like there's quite a few of those popping up, you know, like I mentioned earlier in the episode, where it feels like there's a movement away from AWS and cloud providers of that nature. Who are some of the other compute instance providers that you're seeing your customers use?
So I do want to say that many of these managed offering, or many of these like cloud hosting providers also have like a Kubernetes offering, right? Yeah. So in many cases, like there's maybe like a graduation of folks who are like, I need a server, and then I need multiple servers that run something in a cluster. So like Linode and Hetzner, DigitalOcean is a big one. Those three are the big three, I would say, that like folks are like gravitating towards, past like AWS, Azure, GCP. I do see like a lot more folks are using like smaller, more regional hosting providers.
Right.
In many cases because they're concerned about like privacy laws or latency issues and that sort of thing. I think latency is actually like a bigger one than a privacy law. So like if AWS opens up a data center in your region, you might like say, okay, they're the tried and true, let me use them over something that's been around for a little longer.
Yeah, for sure. And I think there's like that regional aspect is huge because there's these entire like niche markets that exist in just in certain areas of the world, and it'll never scale beyond that, but it's a valuable offering for that area. And I think that's what tools like this. Go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, Heroku is a good example of that. They are hosted in Northern Virginia.
Right.
I think you
on
might
AWS.
be able to get, you might be able to get something in Europe, but I don't believe so. But if you're using it in Asia, like all of your users are going to North Virginia and then back for their traffic. So like a platform as a service that's native to whatever cloud provider you have in Australia, for instance, probably not going to be like a global, hit, but at least locally you'll be doing pretty decent.
Yeah, for sure. For sure. What are some of the common use cases that you see people using this for? Is it for like a static website, server-side apps, back-end APIs? Is there any kind of pattern that you're picking up that like suits itself really well towards this platform?
Unfortunately not. Everyone kind of like is developing their own stuff,
right?
For better or worse. I have users that are like, all I wanted to do is deploy a background worker or a cron task, right?
Yeah.
Folks who like write Discord bots is a good example. They're just like, I don't need a web process. It just runs in the background. We have I know of companies that are using it as like a cheaper alternative for preview environments for Heroku, right? Where they might be paying Heroku hand over fist for their entire engineering team, but they can set up one big server and install Dokku and kind of get most of the same experience there. So there's no real. I don't know that there's necessarily like a specific type of user per se. We haven't gone after a niche of users like Vercel has, where they're like, we own the front end space. We're kind of just like off, in terms of like hands off in terms of like what people install and use Dokku for, which is good and bad, right? Sometimes I get a support request that's like, I don't know if I can load up this page right now. This is not maybe safe for work. Let me wait until later. But generally speaking, it's whatever the user wants to run.
That's actually a really cool idea that you mentioned of using it to stand up your pull request environments. So you would have this running off to the side, completely independent from your production infrastructure, and then your Git hook just builds and deploys your application for the pull review environment. And then when the pull request is closed, it just tears this down.
Yeah, that's correct. We have a GitHub action and like a GitLab and integration with other CI platforms that allow folks to do exactly what you're saying. They open up a pull request, it automatically clones like a test application that you have, like something that has all the environment variables, pushes your application to that, and then once that pull request is closed or merged, it'll shut that down. It's actually like a pretty common use case, I would say.
I always get scared having different infrastructure running for my non-production environments. Like I always think that wherever the differences are, that's where the bugs are.
Yeah, that's certainly an issue that like I've seen some larger companies come against.
Yeah.
Especially when they're running, I think, more cloud-specific offerings, right? So if you're talking about like DynamoDB, for instance, I don't have a DynamoDB plugin, right? DynamoDB is an AWS-specific thing, so it's not like I can replicate how that works. And so there are cases where folks are like, I have this part of my staging environment is over here, and this is over here. That said, I feel as though like for especially for a lot of these companies, they'll have like a primary integration environment that is on their primary hosting provider. And then they'll just use Dokku off to the side for like this review app case. That's pretty common because these review apps are like spin up and you tear them down. You don't really care how long they live for. You know they're probably going to have bugs, but you're going to integrate all of that into your pre-production environment anyways. So it's like fine.
Interesting.
If you find yourself in the spot where you need to create a DynamoDB plugin, you should probably reevaluate your life choices. What steps did I take that led me to this point?
I mean, luckily with that though, it's not that smart. Like I think
Dynamo?
yeah, I mean, honestly, at this point, given our extensive integration with it for managing permissions and roles and whatnot, I think we found a lot of information about how it works just by understanding where the limitations are. Like, it's not just a key value store, you can really think about how they built some things because they sort of leak through, right? Because the less leaky of an abstraction you have, then the more of a layer there is of that abstraction, which adds, potentially complexities. And especially services at AWS, they don't change that much over time. Like, they don't deprecate things. I mean, they make them better as far as the internals go, but the API stays, the same. So unless there's a huge rewrite of DynamoDB, I actually don't think it's that complicated. Enough so that AWS even has like a DynamoDB local version that you can run, and local stack's got one as well.
Should be possible then. I'll get to it right after.
I'm not saying do it.
I'm going to be reevaluating what decisions I've made to get me to the point where I'm making a DynamoDB plugin.
All I did was agree to go on this podcast, and that's where my life turned around, folks. Right on. So let's talk about that. How much time do you spend reviewing the plugins that you have and evaluating what plugins would be good additions to the platform? What's that process look like?
So I've traditionally always tried to use other platforms out there. Like I'll go in and say, okay, I'll release something new, or like Vercel this like neat feature on like running something locally or whatever it happens to be. Just to play around to get a sense for like how it's useful, how it could be useful in Dokku, like whether there is even a possibility of me doing the same thing, right? Not just for the project, but also for like actual like day-to-day work, right? I've worked with teams where like I manage or build the platform, and so how do those features that like we don't have on our platform, how could we utilize them? How do we like take advantage of that sort of stuff? So like I've done that on and off for the past decade, and that's kind of like a regular thing that I do. In terms of like how I decide what gets into the product, a lot of it's just like how often does a request come in, and is that request serviced by something that's already there or not, right? Folks have asked for features that like just don't make sense for the project, right? Someone like maybe once a year or two, I'll get someone who asks, hey, I'd love to run this on FreeBSD. And I'm like, cool, I don't think you have Docker on FreeBSD. So that like we'll stop there, right? It's like it's just out of scope, and it's unfortunately I don't have the bandwidth for that. Likewise, folks will ask for like again like a DynamoDB plugin, right? And I know that there's software to run something similar to DynamoDB locally, but until that software existed, the answer was no, I can't run that. There are features that are like, yeah, this comes up once a month and this breaks someone's workflow, and like they'll file a ticket and I'll be like, oh, that's not supported, or like, oh, that's a known bug. Eventually it'll irk me enough that like I'll fix it, or like someone will come and say, hey, like here's a partial fix, in which case I'll help them bring that over the finish line. There's also features that like would be awesome to support, or like would have been awesome to support, are just such a massive amount of work, or like require n number of steps to get to, that like by the time everything's ready, or even just then, I'm just like, this isn't worth the time that I would spend. Docker Swarm is a good example of that, where there were foundational changes that needed to be performed on Dokku in order to support anything like an external scheduler for years. That like I was just like, yeah, okay, this is the next step that we need to do. And only recently has it gotten to the point where I'm like, okay, this is in a place where like we could comfortably add another scheduler that isn't just Docker local, and that's where the Kubernetes scheduler came from. And I looked again at Swarm because it's in some sense built into Docker, but it hasn't been developed in years now. So it just didn't make sense from like a maintenance perspective why add support for something that like isn't being actively maintained upstream.
For sure.
And so like it kind of like really depends. It's a case by case basis. If it's something small and like it's easy for me to implement, I might do it on a large. If it's something that like I see is actively hurting users or like causing them to onboard incorrectly or causing downtime for them or whatever it happens to be, I'll look into those. And if there are things that are just like they're kind of out of scope of the project or just don't really make sense to do today, I might put it off or just say, hey, this isn't going to happen. I'm sorry.
Makes sense.
So Warren, you probably have a similar process too, just from your own work over at Authorist. Like, how do you determine what features are going on the board and what features are just going to be flat out rejected, and how do you curate those?
Yeah, I mean, you're really trying to get into the product management space. I see. You really want to go and get the PM role right there. Well,
you know it.
I mean,
Jira boards for life.
Yeah, I mean, honestly, for this, my CEO would probably be more of the expert here. But realistically, we categorize things that, I mean, as Jose said, there's a lot there that's just straight on, like 100% the same sort of thing that we do. Realistically, who are our customers and what do they need to keep going? We definitely categorize them as like, oh yeah, like for sure, this is in our sort of roadmap already. It may be further out and we just pull it back and increase the priority. Or this is really cool, right? Like we didn't really consider that, but this would be a great use case, a great both user story as well as something we can publish on our blog to get future customers as well. A real case study. So, I mean, all those sorts of things sort of pull in. And then there's maintenance as well. I mean, I think given my experience, the biggest trouble in companies often in this area is not paying enough time to spin down the tech debt or reduce the amount of fires that you're fighting. So, in the example of we're getting a support ticket every month, on this, that's probably too much for my liking on that specific topic. Like that would cause us to revisit documentation or change the feature. Like the thing I hate seeing in our product the most is an explanation. Like if we have to write an explanation to our customers, to our users, this is how you use the feature, then there's an education component that makes it more complex. And so like eliminating those really improves the UX and reduces the burden on our side to handle every single one of those coming in. And so those are really the interesting things. Like we like seeing where our customers are getting stuck and then try to figure out how could we design our system differently to avoid those. And that's where a lot of our time goes.
So I think that's a really cool end-to-end perspective there, because Warren, you're running a funded company, and then Jose, you're running an open source product, and you've been maintaining that for over a decade now. So how does that fit into like how much non-coding work do you put into the product? Because that's a big piece of it, right? Of like spreading the knowledge that this product exists and showing people what it does and trying to capture a larger audience. And I'm assuming that part of that is a hope of getting people to use it in sort of a way that they would also contribute to the project, so that you're not the sole person building on this day in and day out. How do you approach that?
Yeah, I've spent a lot of time trying to make the documentation super clear, and like Warren mentioned, if there's something like in the documentation it's like this, I mean, I don't know why I'm writing this. This is weird. Like maybe I'll spend more time on the coding side and figuring that out. I mentioned before, like there's a lot of like product sort of investigation, like seeing what competitors in the space are doing, right? Whether they're other open source projects, and there's a ton of them out there, or if they are, funded companies, like what are they doing and how they're handling something, right? Oftentimes, like, it's a party of one here, right? I don't have the time to market or to build out the critical features or, whatever it happens to be. So I have to kind of be judicious about how I spend my time. And so the more time I'm spending on the product, I think is better on the open source project side. But there's certainly like a ton of extraneous stuff that I need to do that like is not necessarily like fun or interesting for open source, right? A lot of it's just like, hey, this person had an issue. How do I replicate that? I cannot replicate it on my end. Okay, well, there's something weird about my environment. Let me go see if I can exactly replicate their environment. Right? Whether that's by like investigating with that person, getting more information, or like figuring out, okay, like there's a step here that like I'm not asking the right question or something like that, or not gathering the right detail for that.
No, delegation's a huge aspect for sure. Getting them to do it.
Oh, and just taking the time and effort to dig into those things, like that's a labor of love. Like, right? I mean, you just have to absolutely love this product to spend this much time and effort into trying to make sure people are successful with it, all for free, because you don't get paid for this.
Yeah, sometimes I sit here and I'm like, what steps and what decisions did I take 10 years ago? No, I really do enjoy working in this space. I've done that for most of my professional career. It's interesting to see how people are making other developers more productive and like helping them ship code and ship product in front of customers, right? So like I love doing that, and so there's certainly like an aspect there where I'm like, yeah, this is great. But sometimes like I'll wake up and I'll see a ticket that was filed, and I'm like, this is going to take 30 hours for me to investigate because like it's pulling teeth because the person isn't providing the right information, they're refusing to, or like actually this problem is pretty difficult and I don't have a way to replicate it just now, so I have to build out an application that does that thing so I can like figure out what exactly is going on, right? So there's some times where I'm just like, yeah, this issue isn't worth it. We're just not gonna, it's working as intended. Sorry. But certainly there's like a love aspect for it where I'm just like, yeah, this is super interesting work for me. How do I make this better for other folks?
Those are the things you don't want to actually even let someone else do. Like you want to do those yourself. So, even if you had someone else come in and help you, they're just taking away the work that you actually enjoy.
But to a certain extent, I feel as though there's certainly places in the Dokku like ecosystem where I've said, hey, I don't have time to maintain this. It's super awesome that you are doing this. Would you like to take this on? Right? We had a maintainer, Michael Hobbs, who worked on the project for about 4 or 5 years, maybe 6. He used Dokku as part of their. He worked at like a boutique investment shop where they basically like provided services to the companies that were running under that shop. And so like you could concentrate on just your product as opposed to doing like marketing and sales and whatever. They provide you like a micro CTO or micro platform team or what have you. And so they used Dokku as part of that. And so he started contributing to Dokku, and he was like, this is great. I use it all the time, but like the rate of change that you're having on this project and the rate of breakage that you have on this project is not great. This was early on in the project. So he was like, the first thing I'm going to do is write a test for you. So we have a test suite. And so like now I contribute tests. And that was like a labor of love for him. He was just like, this is what I do for the next 5-6 years, even past when he left that company. Similarly, like there's another part of the project, our Ansible modules, where like there's someone who maintains them on his spare time. He doesn't use Dokku at all anymore, is my understanding. But like he just contributes to it when he can, right? And so whenever I can step away from a particular part of the project, I'm like, yes, please go ahead, do that. You seem to have a good head on your shoulders. You can kind of take that as you will. There's a little bit of trust that has to be involved there, right? I have someone we just talked about it. I'm still reviewing PRs and releases and that sort of thing to make sure that nothing's going out that shouldn't go out. We automate as much of that as possible, so that way, hey, like in the worst case, that person leaves, or heaven forbid, something happens to me, folks can continue on with the project. And so, whatever we can do to ensure the provenance of the code that gets shipped is super important to the project. But other than that, if someone wants to contribute to a particular area and really own that, I'm more than happy to like help guide them into that path and like make sure that they're comfortable and then allow them to have almost free reign essentially on that particular project. And that's certainly like how I started on Dokku. Like I contributed a bunch of PRs, and then suddenly I was maintaining a product.
Right on. So what's the future of Dokku look like? What are the big things that you are hoping to accomplish, whether that's utilization, recognition, or new features?
I have been working on this project for about a decade now. I'm not tired, but I certainly do want to get us to a 1.0. That's my goal for the year. There are a couple of tickets that are like, if we implement these, they're breaking changes. And they're about the last ones I can think of before I'm like, hey, like this is kind of good to go. We can continue adding features, but not necessarily break things, right? There's stuff around security, adding SE Linux support, for instance, or App Armor and that sort of thing. Not necessarily anything that like is detrimental today, or like our users are impacted too much, but like there are folks who are like very inclined for like to care about these features. So the 1.0 would be super great to have. The other part that I'd like to, once we hit that milestone, that I'd like to focus on is our data store services area. So as you mentioned, we have a Postgres plugin. We have, I think, 16 different data stores that we support. Many of the common ones. So if you need Redis, if you need SQL, MariaDB, Mongo, whatever, right? It's pretty easy to like stand that up and you're kind of good to go. And I think like for a lot of folks, it's a lot easier to do that than to say go figure out figure out the README on the Docker file, the official Docker file, and figure out, okay, like this is how I start, how I stop it, where I'm putting data, how I back up, how I connect to it. You know what I mean?
For sure.
But there's a ton of features in the data store side that like I'd love to implement that have been requested for years. I just haven't had time to implement. Likewise, I'd like to make it easier for folks to contribute either new features on that side, or even just add new data stores. I mean, like over the past 5 or so years, we've seen a plethora of new data stores just come out that are used for particular use cases, like graph databases, vector databases, some of these like new fancy AI databases that I'm not really too sure of, but like maybe 1 or 2 of them will stick. But I don't have time to spend on investigating and figuring out how do you create it, how do you like maintain it, et cetera. But if I can come up with a standard that allows folks to contribute those, I think that'll allow folks to say, hey, like I can use this on my personal project. It's great. And then if they want to, if they need to, they'll graduate to whatever the managed environment is. And then the last part of that is better multi-server support. That's been like just a constant aim for our users. They'll get to a point where they're like, they're running it on 128 gigabyte memory server, right? And they're like, this is good. We have 2 of them. It's awesome. But like we can't scale horizontally, and they have to move on to a provider to build up a team to manage their infrastructure, et cetera. And I think it's unfortunate because like, if you're a company, you have only finite number of resources, and now you're spending some of those resources on building a platform where that's not really germane to running your business. You should just be running your product. And so anything that we can do to kind of like support those folks as they move on, whether they decide that Dokku is, a good fit for them in the future or not, I think is super important. So continued support for clustered environments and making those simpler and more effective for folks to use.
That was a huge understatement there. Like it's spending time and effort building out infrastructure that's not core to the business that you're in. I mean, by definition, that is DevOps.
I'm putting myself out of business.
Dude, putting all of us out of business, which want to be completely transparent. I'm 100% for. Like whenever I go engage with someone new, like that's my primary job, is to make it so that you don't need me anymore. And you're wondering like, who's this smartass that keeps showing up to our meetings and why is he here?
I've had quite the experiences with containers in my life, and I still to this point feel like I still have no idea what I'm doing. Every time I get to a new Docker file, I'm just like, I'm getting it wrong in some way. And I feel like, fortunate or unfortunate, I feel like, you've got maybe a secret view into here on something that everyone still gets wrong. Some words of wisdom or advice to those of us who still can't figure out, how to get the container file to do what we want.
No, I don't. Honestly, it's kind of like I wish there was like some magic sprinkle you could.
Me too. Me too.
There's a ton of this space is very, very vibrant. There's a ton of folks tackling it at all levels, right? The Roku and Cloud Boundary now Pivotal. They maintain the new version of BuildPacks, cloud native BuildPacks, which have a lot of promise for a lot of security focused folks out there. Nix packs for railways is super cool. And provides an alternative for building that Docker file when you have no idea what a Docker file is. But all of these technologies that are out there, there's CNAPs, for instance, but all of these things they're obtuse in some way, shape, or form, right? Even for me, and I've been in this space for more than a decade, it's pretty difficult sometimes to get started. So there's no magic sprinkle, fairy dust I can sprinkle on your project, except to say you're gonna struggle with this for the first 10 or so commits, and then you'll have something working. You'll probably need to revisit it in about a year when you need to update something.
I'm totally with you. I mean, the one that always stumps me is the entry point versus CMD as the bottom of and I'm like, which one is which? If it was me and I had to design this technology, I at least would have called it run with overrides, run without allow overrides, right? That's what I think what I would have gone with.
This is probably why you don't like Kubernetes, because Kubernetes also has a confusion around that. They call it command and args, and how you use them is also just different enough from Docker. You're just what are we doing here?
Right. Let's take a confusing thing and make it even more confusing by not being consistent with it.
Yeah, let's make them new words. I love that.
Right.
Yeah.
Cool. So what else should we know about Dokku?
It's open source. It's MIT licensed. Everything in the community is MIT licensed. I have no desire, as I mentioned before, in the company around this. I sell this Dokku Pro thing on top, but most of our users don't really need that. And you can be productive with it in as small of an environment as possible, up to a large company. Again, as I mentioned, folks are running it in their home lab. They're running it as part of consulting firms. They're running it as part of an offering that they sell out to other customers. So you can be successful with open source, I think, as far as you need to, as long as you need to, right? And that's kind of the core ethos of Dokku. We want to be as extensible as possible to make you successful. And if we're not as successful, maybe we're not the right fit for you, but maybe we are, and there's a small change we can make. So feel free to support us. Feel free to contribute back bug fixes, file issues, report problems, and we'll take a look at them.
Awesome. Do you think that maybe this isn't the right question for this talk, but I feel with the calamity of SSH and XZ, I feel the future of how open source will be contributed to going forward, where the liability falls could be changing in the future. And it's as an open source maintainer, or at least with a company that has open source SDKs and things like that, it's something that I'm at least trying to keep on my radar.
I wonder about that. I don't know. I don't have a lawyer on call for the project, right? So it's not we can say, hey, what happens if someone is hacked when they run Dokku? And actually, we removed features from Dokku to make it more secure. We had a feature that allowed folks to have this little web UI to actually set up their server. And a lot of folks would install Dokku and not go through that web UI. And so we had just reports of folks saying, hey, I have a miner on my server, what's going on? Because someone else would go through their IP, set up their SSH key, and then start pushing code. And so there's I can't say that I'm not on the hook for some of that. Certainly there are decisions I can take that are more user friendly. But I do wonder about that, especially if, there are companies who are hey, we don't use open source because of what you mentioned. We need someone to be reliable. No one ever gets fired for buying IBM and Microsoft.
At some point, we're going to be old enough, and people are going to be like, "What? I don't know what that is." My theory is that in order to commit or push a package to an open source repository, you'll need to have verified real identity attached to it. That's where I think it's going. So everyone that does it with the right goal or mentality in mind will be totally fine, right? Like I'll just throw my copy of my passport up next to whatever packages have my verified commit.
I don't know if I'm going to do that. I have a lot of I would rather just publish this thing to my website. Like just go to Diaz-Gonzalez.com/Dokku and download the Debian package. Good luck figuring out if that's a good Debian package. I do wonder about that because we have users who are they'll come in, they'll have an actual serious question about their server, right? It's behaving incorrectly, and honestly, I can't debug it while going up the server and running 2 or 3 commands. It's very apparent once I run them, but it's also difficult to explain to folks, hey, run these 3 commands, because they'll run a command and then just copy paste the output they think is germane, but actually not what I wanted, right? And so they'll be oh, in many cases they'll be yeah, I can grant you SSH access. Can we do a pairing thing? Yeah, great, let's do that. Awesome. Some cases the user is technical enough that they can say, hey, I can trust them to run that command. They'll give me the exact output and all that. Awesome, this is great. But there are many users who are I can't do that. I can't grant you access to my server. I can't grant you root. I don't trust you, right? This is for work, right? Which is a totally fair statement to make.
For sure.
It's also really interesting to me because I published the project, so in theory I could just root their box. I'd be oh, here's a new Debian package specifically for you. Here, it's built by CI, it's good, and they'll run it, and it's effectively the same thing. So it's in this space in particular, it's kind of a weird place to be in, where it's how do you trust the software maintainer to do the right thing when he already has root to your box potentially?
Right? For real.
I mean, that's what happened here with SSH, right? They already have root to your box. What do you do?
Yeah, it's going to split 2 directions. One, like Warren was saying, where it's KYC, but instead of know your customer, it's know your committer. And then the other part will be the Pirate Bay for open source software. Oh, here's the link. Is this actually going to be the Debian package, or is this actually a virus? No way to tell. So let's do it.
Are you guys not installing your software from Pirate Bay? I do that all the
time. Right.
I think that was the last time I used Windows, and that was probably almost 20 years ago or something like that. I mean, you had to get a copy from somewhere, right?
Yeah, for sure. I was a poor college student at the time. I pay for all my software now. I understand. I also am I got to pay for this because if I don't pay for this and I get it from somewhere, Lord knows what's going to happen. Social Security.
They never attribute to malice what can easily be ascribed to negligence.
Right, for sure.
It's probably not that weird copy of Adobe Acrobat that leaked my. It was probably that screenshot I took of my desktop and put on Twitter. It was oh, look at what I'm working on that leaked my social.
Right.
Here's a note in the corner that has your bank information, your master password, all that stuff.
For real, I stress over that. Posting screenshots. Oh, what's on here that I'm not seeing that I'm going to regret as soon as I hit send?
Well, that's why I got this whole white wall thing back here. I know for sure, all my notes are here, off screen. There's no way the camera is going to catch those.
Right.
I've definitely posted a screenshot in Slack in the past. That's okay, now I have to change 3 different accounts since I screwed them.
Awesome. Well, cool. So should we move on to picks?
Let's do it.
Let's do it. All right. Warren, I'm putting you on the spot first this week.
Yeah. Well, maybe I'll be a little lame. So in a couple weeks, I won't be here hosting on the podcast just for one day. Authoress is going to be at DevOps Days Zurich, and my CEO is giving a great talk on the ROI of security and the challenges of calculating it. And so
right on.
I'll be there. Yeah.
That's cool. I haven't been to DevOps Days Zurich.
I mean, there's 20 or so conferences around the world that all the DevOps Days moniker. And honestly, out of all the conferences I've been to or spoken at, I liked it the best, for sure. Yeah.
Right on. Yeah, I've spoken at DevOps Days in Amsterdam, Austin, Salt Lake City, Phoenix, maybe a few others. Amsterdam puts on a great DevOps Days event.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah. Jose, what'd you bring for a pick?
I'm gonna go with food. I am a huge fan of wings. I can't do hot sauce. I can't do spicy food, but I can do wings. There's a hotel. I'm blanking on the name right now. It's a Hotel Preston in Nashville that makes probably my favorite wings. They're Chianti wine wings, which are super flavorful. This hotel is like 5 minutes away from the airport. It's not the place I would have expected to have. If you're ever in Nashville, try it out.
And if I'm not mistaken, Nashville is like the self-proclaimed home of wings. Is that right, or am I just completely making that up?
It depends on how you count it. There's folks who are like, "No, well, where's the hot sauce come from?" There's a bar I go to that makes one flavor of the hot sauce. I think there's some lore about two different competing places making wings for the first time and having a different way of preparing them. So,
right.
You can never go wrong with food as your pick.
Yeah, for sure. For sure. And in the opposite category of food, I'm going to stick with my pick for the last couple of weeks. And I will be back next week with a new pick. I'll pick something different. But for this week, I'm sticking with...
I get a redo?
Right? Yeah. I'm sticking with PlatformCon coming up in June. 5-day virtual event on platform engineering. Virtual, it's 100% free, tons of great speakers. And if you haven't listened to the last couple of weeks, at the end of the event, I'm going to be doing a live Q&A with some of the speakers from the event. So if you have specific questions you want me to ask, specific people you want me to talk to after the event, hit me up on Twitter. Let me know who you want me to talk to, what you want me to ask them, and I will work those questions into the live session, assuming that it's questions that I can legally ask on air. There is that disclaimer because it's the internet.
You wouldn't have had to, give that disclaimer unless someone already sent you some questions, which, you can't share.
There are a few that I will not be sharing.
These are for the bar.
Right. I'll just say that the internet has not disappointed. So my request.
Undefeated.
It's alive and well. And on that note, Jose, thank you for joining us on the show. This has been super cool. It's been really interesting, and I'm excited to go and try this out because I loved Heroku. I haven't used it, and I think this kind of fits in with the trajectory that I see the industry moving as far as being away from the big cloud providers and towards regaining control of your own infrastructure. I think this is a cool way to accomplish those objectives. So thank you for coming on the show and telling us all about it.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, for sure. If people want to reach out to you and learn more about the project or how they can help or something like that, what's the best way to hit you on the internet?
We have a Slack and we have a Discord. You can hit me up at the Twitter handle, Dokku. If you have Mastodon, we're on HackyDurn as the Dokku user. And again, you can go to dokku.com and get more information there.
Awesome. Right on. Warren, thanks for joining me on this episode. Appreciate having you here.
Yeah, of course. I enjoyed it.
Right on. And to all the listeners out there, whether you're listening to us on the recorded podcast through your favorite podcast player or you're catching the live streams on LinkedIn, YouTube, Twitch, or X that are broadcasting every Tuesday at 7:30 or 10:30 a.m. Eastern and Pacific. Thank you for listening, and we'll see y'all next week.